I overheard a conversation that changed how I see my family. I never thought a simple walk down the hallway could feel like stepping into another life. It was late afternoon, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of floorboards under my feet. I was searching for a glass of water, needing something to settle my mind after a day that had been too full of responsibilities, too heavy with expectations I didn't even want to carry. But what I found instead was a conversation, or more accurately, fragments of one, that pierced through the comfortable haze I had been hiding in. I froze mid-step, my heart beating faster not because I recognized the voices, I knew them too well, but because the words themselves were different from what I expected. My mother and father, sitting at the kitchen table where they always shared their private mornings, were speaking in a tone I had never heard directed at each other, one that was sharp, frustrated, almost raw. It wasn't loud, but it carried in the stillness of the house, filling the spaces I hadn't realized were waiting for it. I shouldn't have been listening. I knew that instinctively. But the moment my mind tried to justify turning back, curiosity rooted me to the spot. And so I stayed, leaning against the doorframe that suddenly felt like a vantage point into a life I had assumed I understood but apparently didn't. My father's voice was low, deliberate, and yet tinged with a kind of bitterness I had never allowed myself to notice before. "You can't keep doing this," he said, and I felt the weight of that sentence differently than I would have had I heard it in passing. It wasn't about discipline or schedule or anything trivial like I had thought their arguments always were. It was about something deeper, something I couldn't name yet. My mother responded with a tone I didn't recognize, a mix of defensiveness and vulnerability that almost startled me. "And what do you want me to do?" she asked. "Pretend it doesn't matter. Pretend I'm okay when I'm not?" There was a pause, and in that pause I felt a shift in my perception of both of them. They were no longer the untouchable pillars I had imagined. They were human, frail in ways I had ignored, burdened in ways I had never understood. My father's next words were measured, almost careful. "I'm not asking you to pretend. I can't keep carrying this alone. I need you to see it too." And suddenly, everything felt different. The walls of the house, the familiar smells of cooking and old wood, even the quiet ticking of the clock, all felt like they belonged to a story I wasn't fully part of until now. They weren't perfect. They had their own fears, frustrations, and secrets that they had never shared with me. All these years, I had thought I knew who they were, had built my sense of security and identity around that assumption, and now it was unraveling in fragments of words I wasn't meant to hear. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I was suspended between wanting to retreat and needing to understand. My mother's voice cracked, a sound I had never heard in my life, a sound that carried more weight than any scolding or laughter she had ever directed at me. "You think I don't try," she whispered. "You think I don't fight to keep things together." And my father, softening slightly, said, "I know you try, but sometimes trying isn't enough when you're alone in it." That line, that confession, changed something inside me. I realized that the foundation I had built my childhood memories on, my understanding of their love, their stability, their priorities, was far more complex, far more fragile than I had allowed myself to see. I had grown up seeing them as symbols of strength and authority, but in reality, they were navigating their own vulnerabilities, their own disappointments, often without me or each other realizing just how much strain they were under. And then came the moment that truly shifted everything. My mother said quietly, almost too softly for me to catch, "I just wish she knew how much we struggle, how much we fight, and still, we do it because we love her." I froze. She was talking about me, about my existence in their lives, the way my presence had been both a source of joy and a weight they carried silently. I had never heard anyone talk about me like that, not in terms of struggle mixed with love, not in a way that made me feel both guilty and appreciated at the same time. Tears pooled in my eyes, unbidden. For the first time, I realized that my family wasn't just a backdrop to my life, a cast of characters in my story. They were people with their own stories, their own battles, and I had never taken the time to truly see them. I stepped back quietly, retreating to my room, the sound of the floorboards masking my escape, carrying with me the echoes of a conversation that had shifted my perspective completely. And in that moment, I understood that seeing someone isn't just about watching them or hearing their words. It's about listening beneath the surface, sensing the weight of what they carry, and acknowledging the humanity in the people you thought you knew best. The rest of that evening passed in a haze of reflection. I moved through the house with a new awareness, noticing details I had always taken for granted. The way my father's hands rested on the table, knuckles white, the faint tremor in my mother's voice when she thought no one was listening, the softness in their glances when they thought I was occupied elsewhere. Every small action and inflection suddenly seemed significant, layered with meaning I had overlooked in the pursuit of my own life and my own assumptions. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying their words over and over, letting them sink in. I realized that the innocence of childhood perception, that parents are unshakable, that love is simple, was a lie. Not a deliberate one, but a natural blindness that fades only when confronted with truth. And I had just been confronted, unexpectedly, with a truth that would forever alter how I understood my family, my past, and even myself. It was a heavy gift, unsettling but transformative. I understood, for the first time, that my parents were not monoliths, but humans navigating complexities they had never asked me to bear, yet had borne silently for me anyway. I drifted to sleep with a strange mixture of awe, gratitude, and guilt, knowing that the woman I was would never look at her family the same way again. The next morning, I moved through the house differently. I felt the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing against every corner, every familiar object. Breakfast felt strange, mundane routines suddenly charged with meaning I hadn't noticed before. My mother hummed softly as she prepared coffee, a sound that used to be comforting, now layered with nuance. I realized she had been holding herself together, performing normalcy, while beneath it all, she was exhausted from the unspoken burdens of her life. My father, sitting across the table, seemed quieter than usual, tapping his fingers lightly on the countertop, lost in thought. I wanted to ask them questions, to break the spell of silence that had followed the conversation I'd overheard, but something told me that wasn't the right move yet. Some truths, once glimpsed, need time to settle before they can be spoken about openly. Instead, I observed, taking in their small gestures, the careful way my mother poured the milk, the way my father absently stirred his coffee as though trying to reconcile two conflicting currents in his mind. Every movement was now part of a larger narrative I had never fully considered. Later that day, I found myself revisiting memories I had taken for granted. Arguments I thought were trivial suddenly made more sense. Moments of tension between my parents, once opaque to me, now revealed layers of compromise and sacrifice I hadn't noticed as a child. I saw them not as simple antagonists or authority figures, but as people navigating conflicting desires and responsibilities, often without anyone to lean on except each other. The realization unsettled me, made me question my own assumptions about what family meant. Growing up, I had believed that love was straightforward, present, visible, and unchanging. But the conversation I had overheard shattered that illusion. Love, I now understood, was messy and demanding, sometimes quiet to the point of invisibility, carried not only in smiles and hugs but also in the silent endurance of hardship. As the day stretched on, I caught myself listening differently. Even casual remarks, offhand comments, took on a new significance. My father mentioned a meeting at work, but I heard not just the information but the fatigue beneath it. My mother joked about errands, but I sensed the strain she tried to mask with humor. Every word was layered, every tone weighted with unspoken thoughts. By evening, I was exhausted in a way I hadn't expected, mental fatigue from the sudden influx of empathy and awareness. Yet there was also a strange clarity, a sense of seeing more than I had ever allowed myself to see before. I realized that my own life had been lived with a kind of blind assumption, that my family's love was a constant, a backdrop, a guarantee. But now I saw it as dynamic, fragile, yet resilient. They were people, not symbols. And that insight demanded respect, understanding, and a reorientation of how I approached them. When dinner came, I noticed subtle interactions I had ignored for years. My father's small nod when my mother spoke, the fleeting smile they shared over something trivial yet meaningful. It was like catching pieces of a hidden dialogue that had always been happening beneath the surface. I participated in the meal more consciously, listening and responding with an awareness I hadn't had before. Every question I asked, every comment I made, was tempered with the understanding that my family's reality was more complex than the version I had assumed. That night, after everyone had retreated to their rooms, I stayed in the living room, replaying the conversation from the previous day over and over in my mind. I thought about the weight they carried, the things left unsaid, and the ways they had tried to shield me from their struggles. It made me ache with a mixture of admiration, guilt, and sorrow. I realized how little I had truly appreciated them, how little I had seen beyond the surface of their actions. In that quiet reflection, I made a promise to myself, not one of dramatic declarations, but a subtle commitment to see more deeply, to listen more attentively, to recognize that love and care often exist in layers that are easy to overlook. The next morning, I approached them differently. Not with questions or confessions yet, but with attentiveness, small gestures of consideration, a curiosity to witness them without expectation. And in that change, I began to feel the first stirrings of a deeper connection, one grounded in understanding and awareness, rather than assumption and habit. I knew, even then, that this shift was just the beginning. That one overheard conversation had opened a door, and stepping through, it meant reevaluating everything I thought I knew about my family, myself, and the bonds that tie us together. For the first time, I felt both the fragility and the strength of those bonds, and I understood that seeing them fully would require patience, empathy, and courage I hadn't realized I possessed until now. Over the next few days, I began noticing subtle patterns I had never paid attention to before. Conversations between my parents that I had previously dismissed as small talk now revealed layers of intention and emotion I hadn't considered. I started to understand the rhythm of their interactions, the way they anticipated each other's moods, the silent compromises they made, and the unspoken agreements that kept the household functioning. Even the arguments I had once thought were insignificant now seemed like carefully negotiated battles, each word weighed for impact, each pause deliberate. I realized that what I had always assumed was simple, uncomplicated love was actually a complex negotiation between two flawed but committed people. One evening, I sat in the living room reading a book, but my attention kept drifting to the faint sound of their voices through the hallway. They were speaking quietly, in that low, careful tone that always carried more meaning than the words themselves. My father said something about work pressures and responsibilities, and my mother responded not with advice but with quiet support. It was not dramatic, but it was profound in its subtlety. I realized that support in their world was measured not in grand gestures, but in steady, persistent presence, in showing up even when the weight of life threatened to crush you. I felt a pang of guilt for all the times I had thought they didn't care, for all the moments I had dismissed their efforts as ordinary. I began to see my own assumptions more clearly, how much I had taken for granted, how little I had considered the unseen labor of their lives, and how quick I had been to assign judgment when understanding might have sufficed. That night, I overheard another conversation while I pretended to tidy my room. My mother's voice, soft and almost trembling, expressed fear and vulnerability that she rarely let surface. My father listened, and his response was patient but firm, a mixture of empathy and honesty. They were talking about me, about my future, about the mistakes I might make, and the lessons I needed to learn. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't just shaping my present. They were already anticipating the path I would take, trying to guide me without crushing my independence. I felt exposed in a way that was both frightening and comforting. They weren't perfect, and they didn't always say the right things, but their concern was raw and undeniable. For the first time, I truly felt the depth of their love, not the love I had imagined as a child, which was unconditional and effortless, but a love that demanded awareness, responsibility, and mutual recognition of human frailty. In the days that followed, I found myself listening more intentionally, noticing the small sacrifices they made that I had overlooked. The way my mother stayed up late to ensure the household was in order, the way my father handled frustrations silently to avoid burdening anyone else, the way both of them shielded me from difficulties they faced alone. It was humbling, almost painful, to recognize how little I had truly understood. I also began to see patterns in my own behavior, how I had mirrored some of their traits without realizing it, how I had sometimes assumed strength meant silence, or love meant endurance without acknowledgement. I started journaling, writing down my observations and reflections, trying to process the sudden shift in perception. Each entry made me realize more clearly how complex family dynamics were and how deeply I had misunderstood them before. I wanted to ask questions, to confront the things I had assumed, but I also recognized that some things needed to be observed, felt, and internalized before they could be addressed openly. It was a delicate balance between curiosity and patience, between understanding and overstepping. One afternoon, I finally decided to test myself. I approached my father in the study and asked him about a decision he had made months ago, one I had never questioned but had always assumed was arbitrary. His explanation was careful, deliberate, layered with context and reasoning I had never considered. I listened, and for the first time, I felt not only understanding, but also respect for the invisible labor that went into choices I had previously taken for granted. Later, when I spoke with my mother, she shared memories of struggles she had endured silently, of moments when she had doubted herself, and of ways she had tried to protect me from pain I hadn't known existed. I realized that the narrative I had constructed about my parents, one that relied on assumptions and superficial observations, was incomplete at best and misleading at worst. They were not infallible, nor were they simple. They were complex, deeply human, and profoundly committed to each other, and to me in ways that were subtle and often invisible. By the end of that week, I began to feel a sense of reconciliation, not just with them, but with my own understanding of family and love. The house no longer felt like a backdrop to my life. It felt like a living, breathing space filled with intention, effort, and care. I understood, in a way I never had before, that family is not merely about presence or affection. It is about endurance, empathy, and shared struggle, about navigating the invisible currents that run beneath the surface of daily life. And for the first time, I felt as though I was truly part of that current, seeing it fully, participating consciously, and beginning to grasp the depth of connection that had always been there, waiting for me to notice. The shift in my perspective began to change the way I moved through my family's home. I noticed the little things, the gestures and habits I had always ignored, the subtle ways they communicated care without ever needing to announce it. My father, for instance, had a routine of checking the locks and windows at night, ensuring the house was secure. I had always assumed it was just habit or worry, but now I saw it as a quiet act of protection, an invisible shield he maintained without fanfare. My mother's meticulous organization of our schedules and meals wasn't mere control. It was a form of foresight, a way to keep the household running smoothly and to prevent chaos from spilling onto anyone else. Observing them in this new light felt like discovering a hidden layer of reality, one I had been too self-absorbed or naive to perceive before. I began engaging with them differently. I asked questions not out of obligation, not as superficial small talk, but out of genuine curiosity and a desire to understand. The answers were often long, sometimes circuitous, but they revealed vulnerabilities and fears I had never imagined existed. I realized that my parents had been navigating the same complexities I faced, only with the added weight of responsibility for another person's life. And in that, I found both empathy and awe. The more I listened, the more I recognized how much they had sacrificed to give me stability and opportunities I had taken for granted. They had suppressed frustrations, carried burdens silently, and prioritized our family's cohesion over their personal comfort or satisfaction. It was humbling, and it made me reevaluate my own expectations and judgments. The ways I had assumed understanding and fairness were automatic, as though life and love owed me simplicity. One evening, while helping my mother prepare dinner, she spoke quietly about her childhood, a story I had heard fragments of before but never in full. She described moments of fear, of uncertainty, and of choices she had made that shaped the person she became, the person who had raised me. Each word carried weight, not in melodrama but in truth, in the lived experience of someone who had been shaped by hardship and perseverance. I listened closely, feeling a mix of admiration, sorrow, and recognition. My father joined the conversation, sharing details of his own experiences and reflecting on the ways he had tried to balance his ambitions with his obligations to the family. Together, their stories painted a picture of life as a negotiation, a balancing act of love, responsibility, and personal sacrifice. It was a perspective I had never considered, one that illuminated not just who they were, but why they had made the choices they had. That night, I lay in my room reflecting on the revelations of the past week. I realized that understanding my family required more than observing or listening. It required emotional engagement, a willingness to see their humanity fully, with all its complexity, flaws, and beauty. I recognized the limitations of my previous assumptions and the richness that came from perceiving them in full dimensionality. Over the following days, I found myself watching their interactions more deliberately. I noticed the small exchanges, the unspoken coordination, the subtle humor that threaded through even tense moments. I observed how they supported each other, sometimes through words, sometimes through silence, sometimes through gestures so slight I had never before registered them. Each observation deepened my awareness and reshaped my understanding of love, commitment, and family dynamics. I began to apply these insights to my own behavior. I approached conversations with patience, asking questions with genuine interest rather than expectation. I tried to anticipate their needs in small ways, offering help without being asked, noticing fatigue, stress, or frustration before it became overwhelming. The household shifted subtly in response, as though my new attentiveness created space for more open communication, more honesty, more understanding. It was a delicate transformation, one that required humility, curiosity, and a conscious effort to see beyond my own assumptions. And slowly, the house itself began to feel different. The same walls, furniture, and objects now held a new significance. I understood the labor and thought embedded in every small routine, every choice, every interaction. I realized that my previous understanding of family had been superficial, shaped by habit and convenience rather than true observation and empathy. In this new awareness, I felt both gratitude and responsibility. Gratitude for the care, effort, and love my parents had given me without fanfare. Responsibility to engage with that love consciously, to acknowledge it, and to contribute meaningfully to the household's dynamics rather than assuming it was an immutable backdrop. This realization weighed on me, but also gave me a sense of purpose and connection I had never experienced. It was a profound shift, one that reshaped not only my understanding of my parents, but also my understanding of myself, my place in the family, and the responsibilities inherent in being part of a complex, living system of human relationships. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I felt a mixture of reverence, humility, and determination. I understood that this newfound awareness was fragile, that it could be lost if I returned to old habits of assumption and superficial observation. But I also recognized its value and its transformative potential, a lens through which I could see my family and myself with clarity, compassion, and authenticity for the first time. Over the following week, I began noticing things I had never paid attention to before. The way my father's shoulders slumped slightly when he thought no one was looking, the way my mother's fingers trembled subtly as she carried groceries, the small sighs that punctuated their conversations with each other, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes deliberate. Every movement, every gesture carried meaning I had never considered, and I found myself piecing together a narrative of endurance and quiet struggle that had existed in parallel with the life I thought I knew. I began to reflect on the countless ways they had shielded me from hardship, how they had carried their burdens silently so that I could exist in a space of relative safety. I realized that my understanding of family had been superficial. Love was not simply a feeling or a presence. It was an intricate, ongoing negotiation of vulnerability, resilience, and unspoken compromise. One evening, while helping my mother organize the pantry, I heard her muttering under her breath, frustration tinged with exhaustion. When I asked her if she was okay, she smiled briefly, but there was a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "I'm fine," she said, but the inflection suggested she meant, "I'm fine because I keep trying." It struck me how much effort went into maintaining appearances, into keeping life moving without exposing the cracks beneath. Later, my father and I shared a rare moment alone while he repaired a cabinet hinge. I had always seen him as composed and unshakable, but in that quiet interaction, I noticed the way his hands shook slightly as he worked, the way he occasionally paused to rub his eyes or stretch his neck. He spoke about work and responsibilities in a measured, almost hesitant tone, revealing his anxieties and frustrations in ways I had never been allowed to witness. I realized that he, too, had been navigating the invisible pressures of life silently, often prioritizing the well-being of the family over his own. This awareness shifted something inside me. I began to approach interactions with them differently, listening more attentively, noticing subtleties I had previously overlooked, and resisting the urge to judge or assume. I asked questions, not to interrogate but to understand, and I was met with honest, thoughtful responses that revealed new dimensions of their personalities and lives. Over time, I began noticing the patterns in their communication. Small disagreements were not signs of instability, but of negotiation, compromises being made for the sake of the family unit. Humor was often a tool to diffuse tension, gestures were layered with meaning, and silence was sometimes a sign of thoughtfulness rather than neglect. I realized that my parents had been operating in a realm of subtlety and nuance, managing complexities that I had only just begun to appreciate. With this newfound understanding, I started reflecting on my own behavior, recognizing how often I had assumed simplicity where there was none. I realized that my impatience or misinterpretation had stemmed from a lack of awareness, from a failure to see the depth of thought, effort, and care underlying the routines I had always taken for granted. One night, I overheard another fragment of conversation, this one between my parents discussing me. My mother's voice, quiet but filled with emotion, spoke of concerns, hopes, and fears regarding my future. My father responded with a mix of reassurance and caution, careful not to impose but willing to guide. I felt a wave of humility and gratitude. They had been thinking of me, anticipating challenges I might face, all while carrying their own burdens. This moment crystallized the realization that love is often invisible work, manifested not only in grand gestures, but in persistent, unacknowledged effort, in emotional labor carried out quietly over time. I began to approach my parents with greater intentionality. I offered assistance without waiting to be asked, listened without interrupting, and observed without judgment. I recognized that true understanding required active engagement, empathy, and patience, and I committed myself to practicing these qualities consistently. Slowly, the household environment began to change in subtle ways. Conversations became richer, interactions more attentive, and the atmosphere lighter yet more grounded. I sensed that my own heightened awareness had shifted the dynamics in a positive direction, fostering communication, understanding, and mutual respect. Nights became times of reflection, journaling my observations, and contemplating the depth of care, endurance, and love embedded in our family life. Each entry deepened my understanding and reinforced my commitment to see my parents fully, appreciate their efforts, and engage with them consciously rather than assuming understanding or presence was automatic. By the end of the week, I realized that my perception of my family had transformed profoundly. They were no longer simply the people I had grown up with. They were complex, resilient, deeply human individuals whose choices, struggles, and love shaped the fabric of my life in ways I had only just begun to grasp. This awareness, gained through careful observation, empathy, and reflection, marked a turning point. It signaled not only a deeper understanding of them, but also a shift in how I approached relationships, communication, and love itself. I began to recognize the subtle interplay of vulnerability, effort, and intention that defines connection, understanding that true closeness requires more than presence. It requires attention, comprehension, and acknowledgement of the unseen labor that sustains it. By the following week, the impact of those overheard conversations began to permeate every corner of my awareness. I found myself observing not only my parents, but also my own reactions to them, noticing the judgments and assumptions I had unconsciously carried for years. Simple exchanges, the way my father brewed tea, the way my mother folded laundry, suddenly felt imbued with intention and care I had never appreciated before. It was as if I had been living in a two-dimensional version of life, and now depth had been added, reshaping everything I had assumed to be straightforward. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard the muffled sound of my parents arguing quietly in the kitchen. Not a harsh, angry argument, but a careful, tense negotiation. I paused, realizing that their disagreements were not signs of dysfunction, but a method of balancing perspectives, of reconciling differing priorities and fears. Each word, each pause, seemed measured to minimize pain while maintaining integrity, a skill I had always thought of as natural in adults, but now recognized as deliberate, practiced, and exhausting. My heart ached as I realized how much of their effort I had taken for granted. I remembered times I had complained about minor inconveniences, times I had misinterpreted their silence as disinterest, and I felt an overwhelming mixture of guilt and gratitude. That evening, my mother spoke to me directly about her day in a way she had never done before. Instead of simple statements or instructions, she shared feelings, frustrations, and reflections on her responsibilities. I listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, resisting the urge to react defensively or dismissively as I had often done in the past. The conversation revealed layers of her personality, of her resilience, and of the emotional labor she undertook constantly to keep our family afloat. I realized that much of what I had assumed was effortless love was actually careful, considered effort, sustained over years with little recognition. My father joined us later, and I noticed a shift in my own approach. I spoke less impulsively, choosing words deliberately, aware now of the weight that language carries and of the importance of empathy. I began to ask about decisions, challenges, and motivations rather than making assumptions, and the responses I received deepened my understanding of them and of myself. Over the next few days, I became increasingly aware of the unseen pressures they carried and the ways in which they managed them silently. My father's quiet attention to bills, repairs, and responsibilities, previously invisible to me, now revealed a careful orchestration of stability and protection. My mother's meticulous planning of meals, schedules, and errands became a testament to foresight and emotional labor, an effort I had once thought routine, but now recognized as profound and continuous. I started noticing how they protected not only me but also each other, adjusting behaviors, choosing words, and sometimes sacrificing comfort for the sake of the household. Each observation reshaped my understanding of family, of love, and of human resilience. One evening, while helping my mother prepare dinner, she began speaking about her past in a way that was candid and reflective. She revealed fears, regrets, and triumphs I had never imagined, moments that had shaped her worldview and her parenting. I realized that the woman I had always seen as steady, composed, and nurturing was also someone who had wrestled with doubt, fear, and exhaustion, and had carried those experiences with grace and persistence. My father contributed in his own quiet way, reflecting on challenges he had faced, choices he had made, and the intentions behind his actions. Together, their stories painted a picture of life as a careful, deliberate navigation of conflicting priorities, human frailty, and love expressed not only through words, but through sustained effort and sacrifice. I began journaling my reflections nightly, capturing insights, observations, and emotional responses. Writing became a method of processing, helping me integrate this newfound understanding into my perception of family dynamics and my own role within them. I documented patterns, noted moments of empathy, and reflected on the subtle acts of care I had previously overlooked. Gradually, I noticed a change in the household dynamic itself. My heightened awareness seemed to influence interactions, fostering more intentional communication, more patience, and a sense of shared understanding. Small gestures were reciprocated, questions were answered with more openness, and the air seemed lighter, yet grounded in mutual respect and recognition. I realized that awareness had power, not as a tool to control or critique, but as a means to connect, empathize, and engage more authentically. In those days, I understood that the act of seeing my parents fully, as complex humans rather than symbols of authority, had transformed not only my perspective but also my behavior. I had begun to participate actively in the delicate balance of the household, contributing consciously to communication, care, and understanding. By the end of the week, I felt a profound shift within myself. I recognized the depth of their love, the magnitude of their effort, and the fragility and strength that coexisted in their humanity. I had been granted a glimpse behind the curtain, and with that glimpse came responsibility to honor, acknowledge, and participate in the intricate dynamics of our family with awareness and intention. The realization was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that love is not simply given or received, but actively maintained, understood, and cultivated through attention, empathy, and conscious effort. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my own reactions were changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was less quick to judgment, less inclined to assume intent where there was none. I found myself listening differently, not just hearing words, but paying attention to tone, pauses, gestures, and context. Conversations that had once seemed mundane now carried layers of significance, subtle threads of meaning woven into every interaction. I realized that my family had been speaking in a language I hadn't fully learned, one of small signals, quiet patience, and deliberate effort. The more I tuned in, the more I understood how much of their lives were hidden in plain sight, how much care was embedded in ordinary routines. One evening, while helping my father with a minor repair in the kitchen, I noticed how methodical his movements were, the precision and patience with which he approached each task. He explained what he was doing, not for instruction's sake, but as if sharing a part of himself he rarely revealed. I listened, not only to his words but to the thoughtfulness behind them, and a wave of appreciation and awe washed over me. He was teaching me something unspoken, that the work of life, the work of maintaining relationships, is often invisible, and that mastery lies in consistency, not drama. My mother's presence in these moments was equally instructive. She would offer guidance or assistance, always attentive, never imposing, balancing support with respect for autonomy. I began to notice how seamlessly they coordinated, sometimes without words, anticipating each other's needs and moods. It struck me how much trust and understanding were embedded in these small, silent acts, and I realized how rarely I had observed or appreciated them before. The pattern extended beyond observation. I began to engage differently, offering help when I saw need, listening with patience, and resisting the urge to react impulsively. I noticed that my attentiveness encouraged a subtle shift in my parents' behavior. They seemed lighter, more willing to share, more open in small ways I had never witnessed. Even casual conversation gained depth, and moments of tension became opportunities to practice empathy rather than frustration. One night, I overheard another conversation, this one quieter, almost whispered. My parents spoke of me again, their voices tinged with worry, hope, and love. They discussed challenges I might face, decisions I might make, and their desire to prepare me without stifling me. It struck me how much they carried silently for my benefit, how many unseen layers of care existed beneath the surface of ordinary life. Tears came without warning, a mixture of gratitude, humility, and realization. I understood that the foundation of my life had been built on countless quiet sacrifices, careful decisions, and persistent love that had gone unrecognized because I had never truly seen it before. The next morning, I approached them differently, consciously noticing the ways I could contribute, assist, and engage. I offered small acts of help, expressed appreciation, and listened deeply in ways I hadn't before. I began to understand that family is not merely a passive network of relationships, but a dynamic system that requires attention, empathy, and effort from every member. Over the next few days, the shift deepened. I became attuned to the unspoken needs and signals, understanding that the true work of love lies in noticing, responding, and participating in the rhythm of life together. I saw the ways they navigated stress and disappointment, how they managed emotions, and how they maintained balance despite unseen pressures. I began to internalize the lessons embedded in their behavior. That resilience is not absence of fear or struggle, but the capacity to act thoughtfully in spite of them. That love is sustained not only through expression, but through persistent care and attention. And that understanding requires patience, observation, and humility. Slowly, the household transformed in my perception. The same spaces, sounds, and routines now felt imbued with intention and meaning. I felt more connected, more responsible, and more capable of participating fully in the delicate ecosystem of our family life. Nights became reflective periods, where I documented insights, noted patterns, and considered ways to continue engaging with awareness and empathy. It was a subtle, ongoing shift, one that demanded vigilance, self-awareness, and humility, but it was also deeply rewarding. By the end of the week, I felt a profound gratitude and reverence for my parents. I saw not only their love and effort, but also the resilience, patience, and intentionality required to maintain it. I understood that observing and engaging consciously could transform relationships, deepen connection, and foster understanding that I had once thought unattainable. For the first time, I felt the weight and beauty of family in a way that was both grounding and expansive, a quiet revelation that reshaped my perception of love, responsibility, and connection. By now, the changes in my awareness had begun to reshape not just how I saw my parents, but how I saw myself. I realized that much of my frustration and impatience in the past had come from a lack of understanding, from assuming simplicity where there was complexity, from expecting clarity where there had always been nuance. I started reflecting on my own behavior, noticing moments when I had reacted quickly, judged harshly, or failed to appreciate effort that had been quietly extended for my benefit. I began consciously practicing patience, empathy, and attentiveness, recognizing that understanding is an active process, not a passive expectation. One afternoon, I observed my father helping my mother rearrange a heavy box of supplies. He moved slowly but deliberately, careful to maintain balance and avoid strain. I watched them coordinate wordlessly, anticipating each other's movements and adjusting in real time. The sight struck me profoundly. This was love in motion, not dramatized or declared, but lived, expressed in precise, thoughtful acts. I felt a wave of humility as I recognized how much had been happening all along beneath the surface of my perception, unnoticed yet vital. That evening, during dinner, I contributed more intentionally, asking questions, noticing subtle cues, offering assistance before being asked. The atmosphere felt different, warmer, more connected. There was a rhythm to the conversation, a sense of flow, of mutual understanding that I had never truly participated in before. I realized that my parents had been modeling these behaviors for years, expecting me eventually to internalize the lessons through observation and experience, rather than through explicit instruction. Later, I overheard a fragment of conversation as they prepared for bed. My mother spoke softly about her own fears and doubts, the struggles she had carried silently. My father responded with careful reassurance and honesty, acknowledging challenges while emphasizing hope and perseverance. I felt a deep sense of gratitude, and gratitude for the sacrifices I had never acknowledged, awe at the strength required to navigate life's complexities with love and integrity intact. That night, I lay awake, reflecting on everything I had witnessed and learned. The realization crystallized. Love is often quiet, subtle, and unspoken, but it is no less powerful. It is found in persistence, in thoughtfulness, in the unglamorous acts that maintain connection and nurture growth. I understood that my family had been communicating lessons all along, not through grand gestures or dramatic expressions, but through consistent, deliberate action. I also recognized that my role was not passive. Understanding and empathy require engagement. Seeing clearly means participating consciously, noticing both words and silences, and responding with care. The following days reinforced these insights. I found myself observing patterns I had once ignored. My father's attention to detail, my mother's balancing of responsibilities, the subtle ways they maintained equilibrium while navigating frustration and fatigue. I responded with intentional awareness, offering support, asking thoughtful questions, and acknowledging their efforts, even in small ways. The change in me was mirrored subtly in them. Interactions became richer, more fluid, and suffused with quiet recognition. Over time, I came to understand that the gift I had received, the chance to see behind the facade, to understand their humanity, was transformative not just for my perception of them, but for my own growth. I realized that empathy, patience, and attentiveness are skills cultivated through observation, reflection, and conscious effort. I felt an emerging sense of responsibility, not as an obligation, but as a natural extension of love and understanding. By the end of the week, I knew I would never see my family the same way again. I had glimpsed the depths of their struggles, the breadth of their care, and the subtlety of their love. That understanding reshaped my expectations, my interactions, and my appreciation for them. I felt more connected, more capable of contributing meaningfully to our shared life, and more attuned to the intricacies of human relationships. I realized that this process of observation, reflection, and engagement would continue indefinitely, as each day offered new opportunities to witness, understand, and participate in the ongoing work of love and care. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of peace. I no longer assumed simplicity where there was complexity, nor did I take presence for granted. I understood that love is active, dynamic, and demanding, and that true connection requires conscious awareness and continual effort. I had overheard a conversation that changed everything, and in response, I had begun to change as well, not dramatically, but profoundly, in ways that would shape my perception of my family, my responsibilities, and my capacity for empathy and understanding for the rest of my life. It took weeks for the full impact of what I had overheard to settle into my consciousness. At first, it was a subtle awareness, flickering in moments of observation, quiet acts of care, and the attentiveness I began to bring to conversations. Gradually, it became a lens through which I viewed every interaction, every gesture, and every silence within my family. I realized that the lives we lead together are composed not only of visible actions, but also of countless unseen efforts, quiet endurance, and persistent care that rarely receive recognition. That realization reshaped my perception of love and responsibility. I understood that being part of a family is not a passive condition. It is an active engagement, a continuous effort to see, understand, and participate fully. I started noticing details that had once been invisible to me. The way my father's eyes softened when my mother mentioned a small success, the subtle tension in her shoulders after a long day, the way they coordinated silently, anticipating each other's needs. Even the smallest moments, a shared smile, a brief glance, a gesture of consideration, carried profound meaning once I began to pay attention. Over time, I changed not only in perception but in behavior. I began to act with intention, offering help without being asked, listening without interrupting, and acknowledging effort that had always existed but had gone unrecognized. My parents responded, unconsciously mirroring this attentiveness, creating a subtle shift in the household dynamic. Communication became richer, more fluid, and more sincere. Small acts of care that had previously been overlooked were now noticed and appreciated, creating a feedback loop of awareness and gratitude. I realized that understanding is not a destination but a process, one that requires patience, humility, and openness. Observing my parents taught me that love is sustained not merely through words or affection, but through the consistent, often invisible, labor of attention, effort, and sacrifice. I began to apply these lessons beyond the home as well, noticing patterns in friendships, relationships, and my own interactions. I understood that empathy is not a passive trait, but an active practice, cultivated through listening, observing, and engaging thoughtfully. Nights became reflective periods where I journaled about daily interactions, contemplated their significance, and considered how to participate more fully in the lives of those I loved. Each reflection deepened my understanding, revealing the intricate weave of care, endurance, and connection that shapes relationships. One evening, as I sat quietly in the living room, my parents moved about their routines, seemingly unaware of my presence. I observed them with the clarity and attention I had developed over the past months. I noticed exhaustion softened by resilience, frustration tempered by love, and the constant, quiet effort to maintain balance. A profound sense of gratitude washed over me, not just for their sacrifices, but for the opportunity to see them fully, as complex, fallible, and extraordinary humans navigating life alongside me. I understood that this perspective was a gift, one that came unexpectedly but demanded careful stewardship. It required ongoing awareness, humility, and engagement, a commitment to never take the visible or invisible acts of care for granted again. In that quiet moment, I felt a deep connection not only to my parents, but to the concept of family itself. A living, evolving system of relationships, responsibilities, and love that thrives through attention, effort, and empathy. I realized that every small act, listening, observing, supporting, acknowledging, creates ripples that shape the quality and depth of connection. Over time, I internalized these lessons. I no longer assumed understanding where none existed, nor did I take presence for granted. I engaged consciously, nurtured awareness, and sought to recognize both the struggles and the triumphs embedded in everyday life. The house, once a backdrop to routine and familiarity, now felt vibrant, alive with subtle currents of care, resilience, and connection. Each room, each object, each interaction held a story, a reflection of human effort, and a testament to enduring love. And I finally attuned, participated in that narrative fully, not as a passive observer, but as an active, conscious member. That realization reshaped my life in ways I could not have anticipated. I understood that the work of love and understanding is continuous, that relationships require conscious attention, and that empathy is cultivated through observation, reflection, and action. The conversation I had overheard months ago had unlocked a perspective I could never unsee, a depth of awareness that transformed my interactions, my behavior, and my appreciation for the people I loved. I knew that I would carry this understanding with me forever, shaping how I viewed family, friendship, and love itself. And in that understanding, I found peace, not the simplistic peace of childhood assumptions, but the profound, grounding peace of seeing fully, loving intentionally, and participating consciously in the life and humanity of those around me. I had overheard a conversation that changed everything, and in response, I had begun to live differently, more attentively, more compassionately, and more fully, embracing the intricate, beautiful complexity of family, connection, and love.